you for joining me for my presentation. My name's Regina, and today we're going to be talking about integrating literacy and science. So how can we use science to enhance our reading, writing, and communication skills? I am the head consultant for Awkward Octopus Productions, and our focus is to help teachers create science experiences that help their children love science. I learned to love science from my family. I was outdoors, and as a family, we were always outside exploring, and that's where I learned to love science. I did not learn to love science in school. But a lot of our students don't have that at-home experience, so if they're going to learn how to love science, we have to do it for them in the classroom. And that is my impetus for creating my program and helping teachers. I personally have over 20 years of experience teaching in a variety of formal and informal places at all age levels. Right now I'm working as a high school teacher and as an instructional coach. So why literacy and science? We tend to put science and math together in our heads, and you're not wrong about that, right? That's the whole STEM thing. But there's a huge component of science that's about communication and being able to communicate with each other. And a lot of the skills that scientists use are related to literacy and communication. And when we look specifically at the principles that when we look specifically at the practices that scientists do to do science, there's a strong connection to literacy. So hang in there. So the best way to make the best out of this presentation is be here. I know it's really tempting, the phone, me too, and you think like, oh, I'll just play this while I'm doing something else, and we all know that that doesn't work. So put your phone somewhere else, maybe put it upside down if it has to stay with you, so it's not a distraction. There is a worksheet that goes along with this presentation, so if you want to print that out, that's great. If not, I would suggest at least having a journal or other notebook that you can write down information that is useful to you. And as we go, I have a few spots where I purposely ask you to pause the video, but feel free at any time to pause your video, to take notes, etc. So we got through the about me. We're going to talk about two different ways of connecting literacy and science. The first one is we're going to talk about some basic literacy skills to help make your science instruction more comprehensible. But then we're going to spend most of the time talking about how you can integrate science into your literacy time. And we're going to briefly go over the science and engineering practices from the next generation science standards, because when you look at those, you can see the real connection between science and literacy. And we're going to go through an example of using this technique called claims, evidence, and reasoning, or CER, that shows how all of that comes together, that the literacy instruction and the science instruction. All right, I'm taking a moment right now to show you my works cited, and I'm doing that because if you're anything like me, when you hit the end of a presentation, you just stop it, right? Like, oh, that's the end of the information that we need. But some of the articles that I used to help prepare for this presentation are really helpful, and if you want additional information about anything that's in the presentation, then that's where you want to go. So I wanted to show you my works cited at the beginning of the presentation, so that way if you wanted to stop and get some of them, you can, so that you know that it's there. Okay, so at the top of your worksheet, or in a journal or notebook or whatever, pause the video and answer these couple of questions. How do you feel about the time available for science instruction in your classroom? Can you think of any ways that literacy and science instruction can be integrated? And are you currently doing anything right now? And, what is that? And how comfortable do you feel about teaching science and literacy together? So I would say pause this video right now, and then we'll come back in a second. All right, so welcome back. Did any of your responses surprise you? Why or why not? I have found that in my own teaching, that I started teaching literacy all on my own, along with science. Just not even not doing it even meaningfully. Like, I didn't set out to do it, but I realized that I was doing it. And then once I realized I was doing it, I started incorporating it more and more. Anyway. All right. So moving forward, I have a story for you. You can read the screen. I have a story for you. My nephew, when he was like in first, second grade, he's like 11 now. So when he was in first, second grade, his mother got a phone call from his teacher that said, we're a little concerned that he's not on his reading level. He's having trouble with reading comprehension. Now, my friend, she's a middle school English teacher, so if there was an issue, she would have noticed a long time ago, right? Anyway, so she investigated. She asked my nephew, what was going on, and he said, well, it was boring, and it was this boring. So she asked my nephew about the assignment, and he said, well, I don't know, it was some boring paragraph about a dog, and I really didn't care, so I just wrote whatever just to get it done. And that's kind of his personality, but I think we all have had students that have that personality, right? And when you make the conscious choice to combine content with skills, you create a more meaningful, a more engaging experience, because now it's not just, oh, I'm reading this paragraph so that I can practice finding main ideas, but I'm reading this paragraph that's going to help us with our science block, and I'm finding main ideas at the same time. There's more of a connection throughout their day. Like, it's not as like, oh, this is just one-off thing that it doesn't really matter. And when you integrate literacy and science, it does that naturally. Okay, I have another story for you. So I'd only been teaching for a year or two, And I was starting our unit on evolution. And before I even introduce the word evolution, I start going through all of the evidence that we have for evolution. And I happened to be talking about how scientists know how old the Earth is and how old the different layers of Earth are. And finally, one of my students raised their hand and said, "Miss, I don't understand. Can you please explain what you mean?" And I was like, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, you keep saying that scientists date dinosaurs, but I don't think they're taking the dinosaurs to the movies. Like, what does that mean?" And I realized that there was a discrepancy in the vocabulary that we were using, because I knew, and I had mentioned this, but it's really common to refer to radiometric dating as just dating, right? Like, oh, they're dating the fossils. Um, and radiometric dating, side note, is when they like measure how much radioactive material is left in something, and based on that, they can tell how old it is, right? So it's really common to just say, oh, they dated that fossil and it's, 200 million years old, whatever. But my students didn't have that definition very strongly in their vocabulary, right? Like, I'd mentioned it, but where they're used to hearing the word dating is, oh, we're going to the movies. So they were confused. And that was probably the first time that I really started to think, oh, I need to watch what words I'm saying and if they have other meanings. So I've listed on here a couple of things that just in general, when you're teaching science, can trip students up. Okay. The first one is academic vocabulary. And that is especially true when you have English language learners. But even with someone who is primarily an English speaker, if they come across a word that they don't know what to do when they see that word, they're going to have a hard time answering the question. And if you ever come across, you ask them a question and they give you an answer and it's not, something about it doesn't quite match up, it's really likely that they didn't understand something in the question that you were asking them to do. The past couple of years, I've been teaching an AP environmental class, advanced placement. And in their open-ended questions, the College Board uses specific verbs to define what they want students to do. It's things like identify, describe, explain. And even at that level, I still go through those words and say, okay, when a question says describe, this is what it wants you to do. When a question says explain, this is what it wants you to do. So just be aware of not making the assumption that your students know what your questions, the vocabulary, the academic language in your actual questions, that they know what that means to do. And you may need to explicitly teach them what to do when they see that word. All right. The second one is the content specific vocabulary, which was my dinosaur example, right? The two meanings of the word dating. So if you take a look at these, I'm sure pretty quickly you can find multiple meanings for them. And one strategy that you can use sometimes is that you can kind of explain why that word gets used, because the basic meaning of it is the same. So like the word nucleus. At its kind of heart, nucleus refers to the center of something. So that's why you have the nucleus of an atom, because it's the center of the atom. You can have the nucleus of a cell, because it's the center of the cell. So the meaning is the like basic underlying meaning is the same. It's just that it's used differently depending on what type of science you're talking about. Another word that now that I'm thinking about it is condensation. Right? Condensation comes from the word condense. Right? We use, as a science person, I think condensation and I think, oh yeah, right? Like that's when the water droplets form on your glass. Well, to condense means to come together. And that's what is happening. Like the water droplets are coming together on your glass to form the condensation. Like that's where the meaning of the word comes from. So explaining those types of meanings, and also explaining, when you have prefixes and suffixes that you can explain the meanings of, that's also super helpful. Like when I talk about photosynthesis, synthesis means to make, photo means with light, right? Like a photograph. Graph is a picture, photo is with light. It's a picture made with light. And then you can say, okay, what do you think chemosynthesis is? Well, synthesis means to make. Chemo kind of sounds like chemical, so does that mean to make with chemicals? Yes, it does. So that's another strategy that you can use. And then I also just want to point out these two particular ones that are on here. Gasoline, petroleum, and oil. Now, we don't use the word petroleum that often, but when we say that we have oil wells, like there's oil wells in Texas or there's oil wells in the Gulf of Mexico, what we're really pulling out of those wells are petroleum. And then petroleum is refined into a whole bunch of different substances. One that we use is gasoline that we put in our cars. Another one that we use is oil, which we also use in our cars. But we have two confusing words that go along with gasoline and petroleum, which is the word gas and the word oil, right? An oil well, right? That's not exactly the same thing as the oil that you find that you would put in your car. And it's definitely not the same thing as the oil that you would put on your salad, right? Completely different. Same word, but completely different. And the word gas could refer to gasoline, or it could refer to the state of matter, right? Solid, liquid, and gas. So it's really important that you are explicit with which definition you're using, because that's a great example. There's lots of other examples as well, but that one's like a really good one there. Okay, the other thing is working with students to help them learn the difference between observations and inferences. Now, depending on your grade level, you might not use the words observation and inferences. And if you've done this, you also may have done this just not in science and use different terminology. So you might have said something like, what are the facts and what are opinions? Or you could have said, what do we know and what do we think? All of those are different ways of asking, what can we observe? What are our observations? And what are our inferences? And this is sometimes difficult for students because we do this every single day unconsciously. We don't think consciously about us making observations and then inferring. We just feel the inferring part. So if you can have your students practice this skill, it's going to help in a lot of different places. And the easiest way to do that is to just show them a picture and ask them, and you can do this as a whole class activity. You can do this in groups. You can do this individually, whatever works for your set of students. But ask them, what things can we observe? What do we know? What are the things that we think? All right. One of my favorite examples of this is from a creator on TikTok. I wish I remembered her name. I would tell you, but I don't remember off the top of my head. It was a while ago that I saw it. And she was telling a story that she showed her students a picture of a woman and a baby. And the baby was like in a little bassinet. And when she asked the students, what do you know? What are the facts? They said, oh, it's a picture of a mother and her baby. And from there, she helped them pull it apart because, yes, there's a baby and there's a woman, but we don't know the woman is in relationship to the baby, right? That's an inference that you made. So what are the details? What are the observations that you made that brought you to that inference? And I have an exercise for you to do on the next slide. So let's go there. Okay, so take a second, pause the video, and then take a look at the following question. What vocabulary might your students be confused about in your classroom? And identify if it's content-specific vocabulary or academic vocabulary. And then take a look at the picture below and then complete the T-chart on the worksheet. Or if you're working in a journal, you can just make a T-chart. What things do you know? What things do you think? And we'll be back here in a moment. All right, great. I hope that you were able to reflect a little bit on what we've done so far, and had some success with completing the T-chart. So just to give you an example of something that when you're doing this with your students, something that you might run into is you might have students say, oh, the people in the picture are hungry, but that's not something they know, that's something they think, and they think that because the table has a lot of food on it, right? So you can help them parse apart what they think and why they think that. All right, the next part of our presentation is going to talk about integrating science into your literacy time. So where I just talked about literacy skills that you can use in science, here the two are being combined together. So you're really using science as the vehicle for learning literacy skills. And there's a bunch of ways you can do this. And if you even just find one of these things that's useful, great. You can take a moment and pause this and like kind of look through it. I'm not going to read it for you because that's dumb. But if you look on the left-hand side, those are the science and engineering practices. Remember I said we were going to talk about the science and engineering practices? Things like ask questions, define problems, plan and carry out investigations. Then the middle column has the core curriculum content standards. And then I went to the North Carolina Department of Education and I pulled some literacy standards from third grade that also support those next generation science and engineering practices. And I'm giving this to you not necessarily because I expect you to like just put them all together, but I want you to see the connection between science and literacy. Because again, we tend to think of science as going with math and not necessarily literacy, but there's a lot of connection between science and literacy that we can use to our advantage. This came from one of the, remember the works cited that I gave you? So that teacher was doing like a little mini unit on shadows. It was like a 2-day unit on shadows. And there were a variety of things that she did to integrate science and literacy, right? They read a book and used the book to make like a picture book, which picture books, by the way, are a fantastic resource no matter what grade you teach. So that's another thing that you can definitely look into. Having students talk to each other, having students write in their journals, creating anchor charts, right? So these are just some general, hey, I want to do this really quick. Let me see what can I do, right? These are some really easy to implement activities that you can put in really quickly. It's not like a long-term, month-long kind of investigation or anything like that, right? This is just some stuff, some items that the teacher used over like 2 days. Another strategy, and this is a specific strategy, this one is a specific strategy, is reading from multimodal text. Which, I mean, you could probably do this with anything, but here's where this gets that like motivational thing, right? Instead of giving students texts on like, I don't know, a random subject, types of dogs. Let's say you're about to start unit on photosynthesis or energy or whatever, right? You could instead do this activity as an introduction during your literacy block. So, multimodal texts refers to both digital and print text. So you're getting texts from different sources. So you're going to pick out those texts. You're going to review them. You know, please don't ever give students stuff that you haven't read. I have made that mistake to decide what kind of strategy you want to use with them. And you're going to want, this is definitely something that you need to explicitly teach. All right. So you're going to want to demonstrate it for them, have opportunities for the whole class to do it together, maybe then work in groups and do it together before they might be ready to do it individually. And provide opportunities for students to practice the strategies as they go throughout the project. So this is a little bit more of a longer term kind of idea. Like maybe like a research project this would be good for. So the example that the article gave, and again, if you want to go to the article and get the like nitty-gritty details, please go on ahead and do that, is they were going to have their students do a project. It was an engineering project where they had to solve a problem and then explain how they solved it. So the teacher chose texts that had a lot of how-to descriptions so that the students could learn how a how-to article is written. And needed to decide when different texts were going to be used. So there might be a certain set of texts that you use right at the beginning, and then you might want to include a text in the middle of the assignment, and then one near the end of the assignment, which also works on that they get to practice those strategies over time. And how you're going to do this. Okay, and again, I strongly suggest that you start teaching this as a like a think aloud, right? Like, I'm going to do this first one with you, and you go through it, and you, as you're teaching, you explain your thinking, like, oh, I think this because, and why you chose to do certain things. And there's a lot of different strategies that you can use, but I would suggest picking one, right? For whatever that topic is, right? Because you don't want to overwhelm students because they're also trying to learn content at the same time. So things like recognizing text structure, main ideas, details, or finding organizational words like first, second, third, fourth. Having them practice writing in science journals about things that they've read using CER, or claims evidence reasoning, right? And again, this is something that you're going to want to model for the students, okay? We are going to show an example using claim evidence reasoning. And also, before I go on, this is a very brief summary of what you would do with this particular type of project. I would need a whole presentation just on doing this. So if this sounds something interesting that you want to do, please read the article because it's super helpful. And it goes through in more detail what the teachers did, so forth. So we're going to go through claim evidence and reasoning. Because I think it's relatively easy to initiate in the classroom, and it has uses in many different places. Okay, so here we are. Claim evidence and reasoning, or CER. So the claim is, whatever their hypothesis, right? What they think. Okay. And you notice I bolded there based on their observations or research. So their claim needs to match with their evidence. And notice under evidence, it says it's important that evidence is relevant and sufficient to support the claim. Those first two pieces, students usually don't have a problem with. It's the reasoning part that students have the trouble with. And this is why this is a great tool to use to help with critical thinking. Because they need to put their claim and their evidence together, explaining why their evidence supports their claim. Right? I think that the sky is blue because I observed the sky for, 30 days, and each day the sky was blue. Something like that, right? And the place where students get into trouble or get messed up is when their evidence and their claim doesn't match. So what sometimes can happen is they already have a claim in their head. Even if you tell them to gather evidence first, they have a claim that's already in their head about whatever the topic is, and then their evidence may not support that claim. And so they try to like shoehorn the evidence to support the claim instead of changing the claim. Which, you know, depending on the age of your students, can become a great conversation about bias in research. But that's one place where they kind of get messed up doing this. But maybe you're asking yourself, well, okay, great, but how does this go with literacy? Well, I'm going to show you. Okay. So again, this is an example I pulled from a paper. The paper's down at the bottom. It's also in the works cited. This is like the brief version of it because we have limited time. Again, I could honestly spend an entire hour talking just about claims, evidence, and reasoning. So if you want more details, please go to the articles. Again, they're really great articles. I wouldn't recommend things that are boring. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the things that we're doing before we do the claims, evidence, claims, evidence, reasoning activity. Okay. So this teacher is in the middle of a unit about habitats. Now, this goes through what she did for the desert habitat, but I want you to know this is not the only habitat that they did this with. They also did this with, I think, 4 other habitats. Okay, so first off, they had a read aloud with a book to get background information on deserts, right? And students listened to the teacher read it and wrote down or listened for information about the habitat. And then together they created an anchor chart that had like things like temperature, rainfall, types of animals, types of plants, and together as a class, they filled in the anchor chart. And then the teacher reread the text to see if we, to catch anything that maybe they missed or to put in additional information. Right? So you have listening skills, you're collecting data, you're organizing the data, you're rereading for comprehension, right? All of those are great practices. Then, the teacher had them do a compare and contrast activity. So, again, she introduced a book called Frog or Toad, and she showed the students the table of contents so students could make predictions about what they thought the book was about. Okay. During their first read, the students gathered information about frogs and toads, and then did similarities and differences, okay, with a partner. And then as a whole class, they created a Venn diagram about the similarities and differences between frogs and toads. Right, so now we have some background information on frogs and toads, where they live, what they look like, what they need, etc. And here's where we're going to put it together into the CER, right? So, the teacher asked the students to share opinions, like what's their favorite food? And then gave them, and then connected it to the fact that scientific explanations need evidence. What do I mean by that? So, like, I could say, oh, I don't like beans. And, like, I don't just not like beans for the heck of it. I don't like beans because they're mushy and I don't like the texture. So the evidence that I have for not liking beans is that they're mushy. When I've eaten them in the past, they've been mushy, and I haven't liked the texture, right? And then making that link to a scientific explanation, right? You're not allowed to just say or make a claim without any evidence behind it. So then the teacher, after they have that discussion, the teacher gives them a picture of a toad, okay? But the teacher does not tell them that it's a toad. She doesn't give them the name of the organism. They only see the picture of it. And they have to make the determination if they think it's a frog or if they think it's a toad. And then they would fill in or create their claims, evidence, and reasoning. Okay, so here's an example of what that might look like. Okay, and this is, relatively simple, but it can be in a chart form, where you have different places for different sets of evidence. This is, kind of just basic. So the claim is that the animal in the picture is a toad. The evidence, dry skin, bumpy skin, and a brown color. Okay, the reasoning, the animal is a toad because it has dry, bumpy skin, and this will help it live in the desert. Right? Remember that they're learning about desert habitats. So in order to make that reasoning, they need to understand the habitat that's in a desert, and put that together with the characteristics that the toad has. And they've also learned information about the differences between frogs and toads as well. Okay? And there's plenty of other reasonings that could have happened. This is also great because there's no one right answer, right? You could have an entire class and each student have something that's slightly different, and they could all be correct. Okay, so last little exercise for you. Think of a science topic that you already do in class and could incorporate any of the strategies we've covered. Okay, give the grade level, give the strategies. And then also do a little bit of reflection on the information. I feel like I've dumped a whole lot of information at you. So go back, think about the things that we've talked about. What things do you feel comfortable implementing right away or are already implementing? I always love when I can find stuff that I'm already implementing, right? Or that you feel like, oh yeah, okay, great. I can definitely, tomorrow in class, I could do this. What things are like, you know what, I really like the idea of this. I think it's going to work with my students. But I need a little bit more time with it, and it needs more planning. And then which strategies aren't you sure about how to implement? I'm not sure if this is going to work with my students, or I need a little bit more information about how to do this. I'm not really super clear right now. All right. So I hope that you were able to find something that you can use to put literacy and science together in your classroom. Like I said in the beginning, we commonly put science with math, but there's plenty of places where literacy and science match up as well. And if this is really new to you and you're feeling uncomfortable with it, and probably the first way to pull this in is to think about the literacy tools that you can introduce to what science you're doing, right? Because you're already doing the science, you're already doing the literacy. Bringing the literacy over to the science probably is going to be a little bit easier. Okay. But if you can find even just like one topic this year that you can pull from your science content and pull it into your literacy block and do some actual, like your actual literacy work, whatever your literacy skill is, for that time period, and use your science as the vehicle for teaching that particular content, I think that you're going to find really awesome results. And I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what questions you have. I would love to hear what things, like really like, oh yeah, this is great. I'm so glad. I can't wait to do this in my classroom. What things you're like, I'm not really sure what she's talking about here. Things that weren't clear. And I also have opportunities to provide extra support if you want to find out about that. Any of those things, feel free, text me, email me. If you do text me, please tell me who you are, because if you're just like, hey, how you doing? I'm not going to answer because there's crazy people out there. So, but I love getting emails. I'd love to know what things really resonated with you, what things maybe didn't resonate as well. And what things you try and what happens. I would love to know. So I hope that this was helpful with you. I hope that you found something that you can bring back to your classroom. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your year.